Good evening, all. Just part two of the discussion between David from Catholic Verses and Joel Pearson from Religious Debates and Alan Kinsey. Let's just kick off. Joel, you go for it.
I was going to go for so David, the reason that we kicked off this conversation was because you said you recently changed your mind and you decided to become a young Earth creationist.
Yeah, I guess the best way to sort of relate what happened is to say that I've always wanted to be a young Earth creationist, but I never had the nerve to come out of the closet. And I just listened to a sermon or a talk, a religious talk by a priest who is a young Earth creationist. And his talk was about Mary and the church. But in that talk, there was a little 2-minute or maybe 1-minute segment where he talked about how obviously evolution is false and theistic evolution is false. And it made a lot of sense. And now I feel comfortable to admit that I'm a young Earth creationist, but I've always wanted to be young Earth creationist. I've never liked the idea of theistic evolution. So I'm just very, very happy to now be a young Earth creationist and to be open about it.
So does that put you against the teaching of the Catholic Church then, since they support evolution?
No, the Church allows various opinions about how the body came to be created by God. The only thing the Church stipulates dogmatically is that the soul, the human soul, is not a product of evolution. It's not a product of any natural process. The soul, the human soul, is a product of special creation. The fiat of God just poof out of nowhere creates the human soul. So we're allowed to believe in theistic evolution, young Earth, old Earth, intelligent design. I don't know. I hope that you know something about all the landscape of creationism, so you can sort of give me something to think about, because I really am a noob. I don't know that much about it, and all I know is that God created Adam and Eve out of nothing. He did not use evolution.
Can I just ask a question? I noticed you said you've always wanted to be a new Earth creationist or a creationist.
Yeah.
You've always wanted to be, but that is not any evidence needed. You just wanted to be something. It's like wanting to be the best. No evidence needed. You just wanted to be.
I can talk about that. Just because I want something to be true doesn't mean it's true. And just because I've stumbled upon one tiny theological argument that makes me comfortable coming out of the closet doesn't mean that I'm right. I'm not claiming to be right. I'm just claiming to be happy. There's a big difference, right? So I'm not claiming to be right. And if I were to claim to be right, I would be in opposition to the Church, because the Church says we don't know yet. We don't know, and let's let the scientists and the theologians battle it out. And there's some questions, like the question of God's grace versus free will, where it came to loggerheads within the Church. And the Pope stepped in and said, look, we're not going to resolve this, not now, not anytime soon. Stop fighting and just go your merry way. Investigate honestly and take into consideration everything that can help you to come to a decision. But right now, we can't come to a decision. So it's sort of the same thing with creation. The only thing that's been established so far is that the soul is created by special creation. But this whole idea of my desire for young Earth creationism to be true, it's neither here nor there. If tomorrow the Church came out and pronounced that theistic evolution is the way that God created the human body, I would just bow and submit to that without a moment's hesitation. I wouldn't go kicking and scratching into conformity and into submission. I would just submit instantly, because that's what my relationship with the Church is. I'm a Christian. I submit to Christ and his Church.
So does it matter to you whether the belief is true?
Of course. Of course. That's the most important thing.
So if you had evidence supporting, say, an old Earth and not evidence supporting a young Earth, then you would just move back the other way?
No, I don't care how much evidence there is for the other positions. I have a theological justification for being young Earth, and so I'm sticking with that regardless. I don't care. I'm completely vastly outnumbered right now by the evidence. I know that I'm on the wrong side of science by all appearances. I know that. That's why I hesitated for 10 years to come out of the closet as a young Earth creationist, because it doesn't look good for this position. But I found one theological argument that made me comfortable saying, I could be wrong, but at least now I have a justification. Before, I had no justification. It was just, I wanted to believe. It was hoping against hope. I had nothing. I really had nothing. And now I have one argument, and that's good enough. So now I came out of the closet.
So you said that you do care whether it's true, but that you don't care whether it aligns with evidence? I don't see the connection there.
Well, because I don't trust theologians, philosophers, or scientists, or myself. I don't trust any human, not even the Pope. I only trust God Almighty. So if God Almighty allows the Pope to define a dogma that theistic evolution is the case, I'll go with it because I trust God. But I don't trust the Pope. I don't trust the bishops. I don't trust the theologians. I don't trust the philosophers. I don't trust the scientists. I don't trust you, and I don't trust myself. So I just go with God.
So that's the difference between the Pope saying something and him saying something officially.
Yeah, it's not dogmatic. I mean, the last 6 popes have been on board with theistic evolution, right? They're free to endorse it. They're free to get excited about it. They're free to favor it and to think that it's probably true. They're free, and I'm free too. And if I thought that I were showing any disrespect to the last 6 popes, I wouldn't come out of the closet. And there is a teaching in the early church. It was St. Augustine who said that we have to be careful when we have controversial positions. We have to be careful that we're not bringing more mockery and disdain and hatred onto Mother Church. And there is a risk of that, and I'm aware of that. And my way of justifying being a young Earth creationist, even though it seems wacky and weird, my way of justifying that is to say that I'm willing to change. I'm not claiming that it's true. I just hope that it's true, and now I'm comfortable publicly saying that I hope that it's true. So I hope you see the distinction there.
Yeah, so you said it was a theological point that made you lean in that direction, although you were already thinking in that vein, presumably because of Genesis and the way it narrates things.
Yeah, I was already bending over backwards, and then there was a feather of theological insight that made me fall back completely onto my back into that prone position where I can be mocked and ridiculed by everyone, non-Christians and Christians alike. Okay, so I'm not afraid of scorn and ridicule. The theological, I think you're asking me what the theological point was that tipped me over the edge.
Yeah, that'd be interesting. Yeah.
It's all about Mary. That lecture that I was listening to was all about Mary, how she is the Alpha and the Omega of the church. If we're going to talk about the church, we need to look to Mary as an example. Mary with her purity and with her holiness and with her virginity and the fact that she's a mother, although being a virgin, she's a mother. And the church is the same way. Mary is perfect and immaculate, and so is the church. And so in this context of the discussion of that one teaching, that one doctrine that Mary is the Immaculate Conception, this priest mentioned sort of in an offhand way that Adam cannot be immaculately conceived in the womb of a non-human beast, as theistic evolution claims. He cannot be immaculately conceived in the womb of any creature. Therefore, he was created by special creation, by fiat, because we know that until the fall, he was immaculate, and it's only at the fall that he became in a state of sin. He was sinless up until that time. So either he was immaculately conceived, in which case Mary is not the one unique immaculate conception as the church teaches clearly, or he was not conceived in the womb at all. He was just created by special creation. So this is the one theological point. There may be good counter arguments, theologically good, sound Catholic arguments that are based on other pronouncements by other popes and other dogmas that qualify what it is to be the unique Immaculate Conception. in the case of Mary. Maybe there's a way where Adam can be immaculately conceived in the womb of a beast, but I haven't heard any argument to that effect.
I'm curious about this womb of a beast thing. Is that something that theistic evolution teaches?
Of course, of course.
So how does that work? There's a non-human that gives birth to a human.
Yeah, which I find repugnant as a Christian.
That sounds like an abandonment of evolution. It's a very odd thing to say.
I may be misrepresenting it because as I told you before we did this interview, I don't know a lot about the science. I don't even know a lot about the theology, frankly. I basically just have this fondness for the literal or quasi-literal or more literal interpretation of Genesis. Genesis is one of my favorite books. I love the stories. I remember even in Sunday school as a Protestant boy loving the stories. The sort of Sunday school presentation, you can grasp these colorful images and, Adam and Eve and the fall and the Tower of Babel and Noah's Ark and the flood and all these sorts of things. I love it. And I want to maintain that. I want to maintain that.
Just to set the science straight on it, evolution doesn't say that a non-human gave birth to a human. That's not how evolution works. It's far more gradual than that. You'd have to zoom out, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years before you could draw a line and say there's humans on that side and not on that side of this line. Yeah. There was never an individual who was different from their parents to that extent. It's like trying to look at a photograph of yourself every single day of your course of aging and try and find one where on one side you were a child and then the next photograph you were an adult. There's no clear dividing line.
Yeah. I'd love for you to talk to someone that subscribes to theistic evolution and find out what they actually believe. I don't actually know what they believe, but it sounds ridiculous to me, and it sounds probably ridiculous to you too. But maybe they have a fancy story. Everyone has a story, right? The what do you call it? The naturalists, like materialists, they have a story for evolution, right?
Probably methodological naturalists. But yeah, the theistic evolution group, interesting because it's like taking in this fact and then incorporating some theology on top of it, which realistically is how all of Christianity has evolved throughout history anyway, where anytime they've been proven wrong about something, they've just incorporated it into their theology and moved on.
Yeah. What do you think about my position where I just want that innocent, childlike Sunday school portrayal of Genesis without, of course, being so naive that I'm reading Genesis like it's a film script, right? But trying to maintain some kind of connection with the stories. What do you think about that?
I think you can read Genesis and most of the Bible in many different ways. You can go completely literal, although it would contradict itself a fair bit. So you're forced to put some things into allegory. And the problem is that we don't have the original author's intentions. We don't have an understanding of a real understanding of the situation in which these were written, because of course this was oral tradition in most cases before it was written down. Especially in the case of Genesis, you can actually see influences from earlier Sumerian legends and Akkadian legends. So I assume you know the Epic of Gilgamesh? The story of Utnapishtim, which was basically Noah's flood before Noah's flood. So that story influenced the telling of the Noah story.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. If you look, one of my favorite patriarchs is Noah. I don't know if you can see him here on my piano.
Just off the edge, I think.
Yeah, he's just a little icon there of Noah. He's one of my favorites. I love the story of him and his family and the flood and all that sort of thing. But I was just listening to a lecture by that same channel, which is called Sensus Fidelium. It's sort of like a traditional, quote unquote, traditional Catholic YouTube channel. But there was a talk on there about all the different flood stories around the world. And not only that, but all the different genealogies that go back to Noah and Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And there are many, 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 many stories of these genealogies going back to Noah and his 3 children. I don't know if you're aware of them, but they're all over, like on every continent and in most countries. So it's really
interesting. So the ones that have a common theme of the boat and the rescuing the animals and all that tend to be focused around the Mesopotamian region. There are other flood stories elsewhere, but they're very different stories.
Yeah, but the genealogies, there are people claiming from the four corners of the world, basically, there are people claiming to go back to Noah, or someone whose name is sort of a cognate of Noah and Shem. And of course, it would take a lifetime to sort of unravel the mystery of these wild claims that are made by anthropologists, right? Like, I mean, I don't have time to research anything. That's why I don't really waste my time with looking at the evidence for young Earth creationism, looking at the evidence for old Earth creationism or theistic evolution. I don't have time for that, because I mean, you could just spin your fancy tale based on this mountain of data, and once you're happy with your story that it looks coherent, then you think you know the truth. But I think that's naive.
Yeah, I suppose the age of the Earth becomes more relevant in positions where you have a job to do that's relevant to the age of the Earth. Like, for example, astronomy. It's impossible for the Earth to be that old when, for example, there was a photograph taken recently, or I say a photograph, an image taken of a galaxy that's 50 million light years away. So obviously, for time to have extended that long, it's impossible for the Earth to be so young.
Yeah, I don't know. Like I said, I don't make any claims. Like, I'm sure that people are going to assume that there's all kinds of baggage that I've accepted about cosmology, about astronomy, and about anthropology and civilizations, and biology in general, and genetics and everything else. I'm sure there are all sorts of assumptions that are being made about what I believe, but I haven't looked at any of that. I don't know anything about it, and I don't want to deny any data, any evidence. I don't want to deny any of it, but I also am not committed to modeling any of it. And when I say I'm a young Earth creationist, I'm not saying that the Earth is 6,000 years old. I have no idea. I haven't looked into it. I know there are people out there that are claiming that they know.
It's based on Usher's calculation, isn't it?
I've heard that, but I'm just not that terribly interested in it. But I mean, if someone asked me, do you think the world is 6,000 to 10,000 years old? I'd say I have no idea. I haven't looked into it. I haven't looked at the data. I haven't even looked at, these. I know these names: Ken Ham, Kent Hovind. Those are the two names I hear.
Oh, don't ever watch any of their stuff.
All I hear is that they're completely nuts, and so I'm not attracted to find out what they're teaching. First of all, they're not Catholic, so why would I listen to some wacko? I'm not saying they're wacko. Maybe they're not wacko. Maybe they're sane. But everything I hear about them is they're wacko, and they think that they know things that they just can't know.
I suspect that they are actually sane. I think they can make a lot of money off of gullible people.
I'm not sending them any money, so don't worry about that.
Well, no. So if you're taking the story of Genesis literally in the sense of the young Earth creationism and the general creation story, does that mean you also take the firmament story literally?
Tell me what you mean.
So in biblical cosmology in Judaism at the time, the firmament was the dome over the earth.
Okay.
For example, the Noah's flood involved the waters coming down from a window being opened in the sky. And there was water over and under the earth.
Yeah, I don't believe that. I don't want to believe that, but I'm willing to believe that. It seems like it's going that one step further into cuckoo land. But now we're getting into like flat Earth territory and all that sort of stuff. And
yes, that's a logical extension of the
I'm open to that. I am open to that. I mean, if you haven't noticed by now, I do like the wacky and the weird. I mean, the more wonderful and strange reality is, the better, as far as I'm concerned. But I'm not attracted to the flat Earth thing. But I have to admit that a lot of people were coming at me on Facebook when I came out of the closet, and some of them were saying, well, if you're a young Earth creationist, the next step is it kind of goes hand in hand with being flat earther. So you better buckle up.
The flat earthers do tend to get their ideas from either the Bible or the Quran, because both involve flat Earth models. It's a really interesting sort of logical extension on down that road.
Yeah, so it is possible. I mean, it just seems a little bit wacky. I mean, I'm just trying to think about my own personal experience, like going on airplanes and like, is there anything that I've already lived that sort of rules out the flat Earth?
Have you ever driven towards a mountain?
Yeah.
Which bit of the mountain do you see first?
The top, yeah.
Yeah, that's instantly destroys the flat Earth.
Have you got? Oh yeah, okay. I wanted to ask you. Feel free, by the way, to pull me out of young Earth creationism. Like you'd be doing me a favor if it's not true, right? But in that vein, I was just wondering: is there a technology that depends on evolution? Because quantum physics gives us the technology that we're using to communicate now to a large
Absolutely,
extent.
yeah.
Are there
All of modern
technologies?
biology. So all of modern biology depends on evolution. Virtually all of modern psychology depends on evolution, because the way you understand human thought processes is based on the environmental survival advantages earlier on. I'm just reading a book actually called Survival of the Prettiest, which is a psychologist's perspective on beauty and how beauty is based on evolved human reflexes. And our modern living is only very short time. We've only been, for the last 12,000 years, an agricultural species. So before that, we were hunter-gatherers, small roving bands where it was easy for us to understand who everyone was. So the anonymity of modern cultures and cities is quite new to us. Our brains haven't evolved to cope with that. And there's all sorts of other things where you can explain human behavior through the evolutionary model. And of course, geologists, oil companies, very much interested in evolution and deep geological time, because that's how they find what they're looking for. So yeah, huge areas of scientific disciplines and practical disciplines rely on evolution and deep time.
Especially medicine as well.
Yeah. So antibiotic resistance is a great example. When they tell you to take antibiotics, they tell you to finish the course, even if you feel better. That's to kill off every last remaining one. Because if you don't finish your antibiotics course, a few of them may still be alive. And the ones that are still alive are the ones that were most resistant to that antibiotic. And then when they come back and breed again, they come back with a vengeance and they're resistant to the drug that killed them last time. So you're just making them stronger. So this is evolution is something that's used constantly in medicine.
Has the one thing that I've heard about evolution is that it's just it's a nice story, but it's never actually, there's no evidence for it. Meaning that for example, there's no experimental proof that we can have, for example, 60,000 generations of this particular relatively simple life form evolving. And there's one example that's given in the textbooks where they say, oh, look, it finally evolved a new trait. And that trait was actually just a defect where it used to be protected from oxygen. And then now it gained the trait where it was no longer resistant to oxygen. And then it just couldn't.
Well, we just mentioned one, bacteria becoming resistant to antibiotics, creating superbugs. That's a perfect example of evolution in action, where they've developed a new ability which makes them stronger and tougher.
So if I believe in adaptability, does that mean that I'm believing in evolution?
Yeah, that's what evolution is. So
I believe in evolution then. I'm a young Earth creationist that believes in evolution. If evolution is adapting, then I adapt, therefore I believe in evolution, right?
Well, so the thing about evolution in terms of the scale at which the diversity of life is diversified so far is it only works on deep time. So say you go 6 to 10,000 years, that's not enough time to get humans and cats, for example. You'd have to go much further back than that.
Right, but that's assuming that humans and cats weren't created by fiat, by God.
Yeah, so you would have to go with young Earth's model where the kinds were created and then have started evolving as well. But then you have the issue of, if you had separate kinds created, why do they have so much in common with each other, which all these markers of common evolution? For example, humans have defective monkey genes where we can't metabolize, we can't produce our own vitamin C, I think it is, which is something shared in common with all monkeys.
Yeah. I don't know. I'll look into it, but it sounds like I have heard one thing that sort of touches on that, which is the one of the reasons the flood was the punishment of the flood came is because people were were engaging in bestiality with these non-human bipedal creatures, and I don't know. I just briefly heard that.
Nephilim.
The Nephilim, is that what they call them? The
The
giants?
Nephilim goes further back, I think.
Yeah.
But yeah, so the idea of angels breeding with humans, creating a race of giants. If you want to learn more about that and about the firmament, the Book of Enoch is quite interesting. It's in the Ethiopian canon. Have you heard of that one?
Yeah, I've been meaning to read it because there's a chapter on Noah in there that I want to read.
Yeah, it's basically fan fiction of angel rape.
Okay. I'm not big into rape stories, but
it's pretty much, well, that's in Genesis already, so
yeah. Well, yeah, there's lots of rape in the Bible, but I don't read the Bible in order to be titillated by sex.
That's not what I meant, but that's like the origin of Enoch, is that somebody read that little story there about the Nephilim, and they decided to go and spin off from that and make their own story.
Okay. Yeah,
but it was actually considered part of the canon by some of the books in the New Testament. I forget which ones, but some of them actually reference the Book of Enoch as canon, which is quite interesting.
Yeah, there are a few works that are referenced within the canonical scriptures for sure. But what was I going to tell you? I guess I'll let you follow your train of thought because I forgot my question I had for you.
Well, I was just explaining one of many ways that evolution is true. Another one, you mentioned not having any real-world examples of many generations, but the Lenski experiment is exactly that, where there were, I think it's 12 different branches where they've got E. coli, which are all... So E. coli have something special about them where they've lost the ability to metabolize citrate, whereas a lot of other related bacteria have.
No, but that's only in oxygen. That's the example I gave. That's the example I gave where they spin it so it looks like a success story, but actually it's in the presence of oxygen. That's the detail that they leave out, and that changes everything because it shows that it's a defect where the E. coli had the ability to protect themselves, and then they lost that ability. It's like a defect. That's what I read.
So if you actually look at the results of the experiment, the E. coli were massively more successful when they evolved that ability. And it was also a multi-step ability because it was the same strand of 12 that evolved it twice, because they went back, because they freeze them each generation. So what they were able to do was go back to a bunch of different previous ones and see which ones re-evolved that trait, and it was after a certain point of generation. So you can see it was a multi-step evolutionary process. But they was definitely more successful because they were able to expand to a greater thickness. That's what was noticed about them. They'd found another source of energy which they didn't previously have access to. So it's a massive boost for their performance. They're much better able to survive.
It's like saying Lay's potato chips is a boon to Western society because people are so much thicker now.
Well, a new food source, that's the important thing. So anything that can metabolize more food and reproduce more. I mean, the greatest marker of success in evolutionary terms is their reproductive success. And this particular strand became massively successful compared to the others. They were able to reproduce much faster and have more offspring.
On a really silly tangent side note here, why don't you reproduce more then?
Well,
although you reproduce more than I, you've reproduced more than I.
Presumably you already know the limitations. So what happens when you take the predators out of an environment? So say you stop predating on rabbits, you end up with a massive explosion of population of rabbits where they overgraze and they end up reverting back to the levels they were at before because they kill off their food source. And humans, I'm sure you've already seen the projections of human expansion where we keep doubling every generation, and it's not sustainable. So we will hit a peak where we'll probably hit some starvation problems unless we can be intelligent enough to get a handle on our reproduction.
Yeah. Did you hear about when they introduced the frogs into Australia to get rid of some other pest?
I can't remember if they did it deliberately, but yeah, the frogs ended up spreading, becoming huge pests.
Yeah, the cane toads.
Same with rabbits, actually. Rabbits were brought across. It was one pregnant rabbit that a settler brought with her.
Wow. Yeah. So, I mean, I have heard something about a distinction between microevolution and macroevolution. Do you want to talk about what that is? Is it real?
Yeah, sure. So microevolution is adaptation, mutations, changes within a species. Macroevolution is when you get two strands of species that are separated physically so they can't interact with each other, and they diverge sufficiently that when they get back together, they are no longer able to interbreed. So, like, lions and tigers can have ligers and tigons, but they are infertile. So they have just gotten further away from each other because of the geographic split. Because obviously you get tigers in Asia, you get lions in Africa. You can see how they've separated geographically from a common ancestor, and they can still sort of reproduce, but they're genetically different enough from each other that they can't properly reproduce and continue to have fertile offspring. Same with donkeys and horses. You end up with a mule, or what's the other one called? A hinny or something like that. I forget the other term, but you get this crossbreeding doesn't work anymore because they've evolved down separate paths, but they're so clearly related, they're almost identical to each other.
Okay. And so some people I've heard claim that there is no actual missing link between humans and non-humans. There were a couple of spoofs that were made, like Lucy and stuff like that. You talk about that?
Piltdown Man was a hoax. Lucy is not a hoax, actually. She was one of hundreds of examples of the same species. So that goes back, let me think, 6 million years or something like that. I forget the exact amount. But there's quite a long chain of different connections going back millions of years where you can connect humans onto the other great apes. And not only that, but the thing is, fossils are actually some of the weakest evidence for evolution. The other paths of evidence are far stronger. So phylogeny is the most powerful connection where you can actually see genetically and in terms of taxonomy, the links branching everything back up to a common root. And you can actually use diagnostic characteristics like we have a palate in the roof of our mouth which separates our breathing, which other animals don't have. But every animal down the same branch of the tree as us shares this common trait. So you can see that we're more closely related to some than others. So snakes, for example, have a separate tube for breathing so that they can swallow prey and breathe. But we can quite happily chew and breathe at the same time.
Interesting, yeah. So Aaron Ra is a big guy in the phylogeny project, right?
Yes, quite a fan of him. I helped the project slightly, but really I didn't do that much compared to the guys doing the real work, programming the database, entering all the information. And just that whole, his phylogeny challenge is, I think, unbeaten so far. It's anyone who takes that challenge, it means they have to, I think the only way you can lose is by refusing to answer a direct question.
Okay, I have no idea what you're talking about. Can you tell me what the challenge is?
Yeah, sure. So the challenge, or the basic challenge, is to show him two kinds, so completely unrelated creatures of any kind, life forms of any kind, that were individually created by God and who are not related to each other.
I see. Okay.
So if you follow him down the the branching tree of life and the connections, you actually end up always back at the beginning of the tree.
Okay.
So any two things that you can name that are alive are related in some way.
Okay. And so is this a project that will constantly be gathering more and more evidence, or is there an end goal like with the Human Genome Project where it was completed?
Oh, the Phylogeny Explorer project, I don't think it will ever be completed because life is too complex. Okay. It's something where the goal is ultimately to map all of life, which if you consider that 99.99 etc% of life forms are already extinct, that's a ridiculous task and you could never possibly find all of them.
Okay.
Because of course you've got these extinction events where something like 3/4 of all life dies and then we start again.
Okay. Yeah, this is one of the arguments against theistic evolution, is that God would not have used this messy trial and error technique to give birth to humans, and sort of a trail of blood and disease and misery behind that human creation story, right?
Yeah, I can see why that works. In fact, have you seen Christopher Hitchens talk specifically about that, where he says, say you give 100,000 years for humans to evolve. And he says, okay, so you've got, for say 90,000 years, God watches with indifference. And then it's only recently that he goes, all right, now we better go down there and intervene. So all the people who, lived and died before that don't get saved. And you have like this very small group of people in recent history, say the last 2,000 years, where he goes, okay, now we'll go down and intervene and do the whole Jesus thing.
Yeah, well, that's not what the church teaches. The church teaches that those who lived before Judaism, or those who lived before the Messiah came, the Jewish Messiah came, they have they're called the righteous, right? And they went down to the underworld when they died, and then when Jesus was killed, he went down and he rescued them. You can see that famous icon of the harrowing of hell. They call it hell, but it's not the deepest. It's not hell. It's sort of the limbo of the righteous. But he's going down and he's taking up Adam and Eve by their hand and bringing them up to heaven, because the gates of heaven were closed up until that point. So the gates of heaven were opened, and then the righteous went up from quote unquote hell, this limbo of the righteous.
Yeah, it's a later theological point that I think they forgot to address in the original stories.
In the Bible?
Yeah, you've got, because of course you got Paul's letters that don't really address it. The Gospels don't really cover it, and then you have later editions and other epistles.
Jesus himself talks about it, how Abraham's up in heaven and with Lazarus and the rich man. Do you remember the parable?
Yes, I do remember. And Lazarus was later turned into a new character in John's Gospel.
I don't know if that's...
He started out as a parable character and then was repurposed into a full character.
There are lots of names that repeat in the Bible. I wouldn't be too quick to jump to that conclusion, but
Lazarus is pretty unique.
Yeah, there might be only two. There might be more. I don't know.
Could be. But the weird thing about Lazarus is that in John's gospel, he's a central character. He's actually the reason that Jesus is executed. But the other three gospels that came before John had never heard of Lazarus.
What leads you to believe they hadn't heard of him?
Well, they don't mention him at all.
Okay.
But in John's, he's the disciple Jesus loved, and he is also the main reason for Jesus being pulled up again on charges and then eventually executed. It specifically says it's because of the resurrection of Lazarus that they start to plot against him.
Yeah, I don't know. It's these are like eyewitness testimony accounts from three different perspectives with three different agendas, right? With four. I'm sorry, talking about the four gospels, the different audiences and all this sort of thing. But I would.
Well, the weird thing about them is they're not eyewitness, and they don't even claim to be eyewitness testimonies.
No,
because they're anonymous and they're written as third person, and they use narrative devices where they are able to hear things that no one could possibly have witnessed and no one could possibly have seen. So like Jesus talking to himself when he's praying, when he's far away from the rest of them, and things like that. But yeah, they don't even say where they got their information from. But the time at which they were written and the nature of their writing shows that they're not eyewitness testimony. There's just a whole variety of the reasons.
Hey, Jesus, what were you doing over there for so long? I was praying. I prayed 3 times. I did this. I did that. I don't know.
And then he was just taken away, yeah.
I don't know. I wouldn't want to get into the hairy business of interpreting the Bible. That's very...
They were also written in Greek, which was highly educated Greek, which doesn't fit well with the whole disciples, fisherman thing.
It's all a great mystery to me. But
it's also even more interesting that Paul didn't know about those disciples. He's only heard of apostles.
Okay, you don't think he mentioned Luke, for example?
Luke, yeah, which is where the name of the Gospel of Luke got its name. But if you read Luke, it never calls itself the Gospel of Luke. It never says it's written by Luke. That's a later church tradition added back onto the book.
Yeah. I don't know. I wouldn't be in a position to make any judgments about
I recommend,
any
learning about the Gospels and the New Testament in particular. It's fascinating to see what went into it, who wrote it, why they wrote it, what sort of motivations they had, where they disagree with each other. There's this whole pattern of how they were assembled, and also really interesting is the stuff that was left out. I'm sure you're aware of many apocrypha. There's about 40 odd Gospels, and only a few of them made it in.
Yeah, what I find more interesting is the fact that we don't have any original manuscripts. We just have copies. So that to me is more interesting. And that fits in with my Catholic worldview, where I have a living magisterium, I have a living church who interprets the sacred deposit of faith for me. And the sacred deposit of faith is sacred tradition and sacred scripture. So I find it fascinating that we don't have the original manuscripts. We only have copies, and there are many there are many discrepancies among the copies, and I find it fascinating. It lends more weight to my Catholic faith, and it sort of, in a way, it undermines all non-Catholic forms of Christianity. Those who would claim to put their faith in the Bible alone, I don't know how they do it without divine protection from teaching error concerning faith and morals.
Through ignorance, I suspect, because obviously the first two intact codices we have are the Vaticanus and the Sinaiticus, I think, and both of them have books that we don't have, and we have books that they don't have. So it's clearly been modified over the years. It's also just interesting to see the ones that almost didn't make it in, like James nearly didn't make it in, Esther nearly didn't make it in. These books where people argued back and forth over it and seemed to have fought over which books were holy and which books weren't.
Yeah, I have had. Go ahead.
And Revelations never made it in.
Yeah,
that was a later push in, shoved in.
And that's not even counting the stories inside the books that were then added later, like the Pericope Adulterae. The story of Jesus and the woman caught in adultery was added centuries later. And the ending of Mark's got 5 different endings, and the original actually cut off at 16 verse 8. There's all these things where we've got the textual evidence to show. You go back to the oldest, the best manuscripts, and they don't have these stories. They were added in later. And in the case of the woman in adultery, that was actually added in different places in different manuscripts because they had to squeeze it in on the bottom of a parchment.
Yeah, it makes a good movie line, though. Let's be honest.
It is probably the best story. I think of all the stories you can have in the New Testament, that is the best story. You can see why they added it.
But the one of the thought experiments I like to play with in terms of the Bible and the mystery of the Bible and the infallibility of the Church is it's a little bit edgy. I don't know if it's Catholic to even talk about this, but one of my sort of fantasies is that God gave permission to the Church. He gave authority to the Church, he gave infallibility to the Church, and he gave indefectibility to the Church. This is well established. But what I'm going to say next is not well established. It's my own little fantasy, which is that it is in a way arbitrary what books made it into the canon of Scripture and which ones didn't. And it was just arbitrary in the sense that the Church said, and whether they were right or wrong, it's bound. Now it's bound. What they bound on earth is now bound in heaven. So, and what they loosed on earth is loosed in heaven. So it's a sort of arbitrary in that way, but God let them, because God is so powerful, he let the Church, which is admittedly full of frail and fallible humans, make these decisions, and then he ratified the decision. It's like he's just going with it. It's like he let the Church decide, and he can work with anything. And if the Church had picked other writings to canonize, God would have worked with that. I think this is a little bit controversial. It's a little bit wacky. I've never ever heard anyone in the Church teach this idea. It's just a fantasy I have to sort of reconcile. How can we even know what's in the Bible? And maybe there are good scholarly reasons why the Church thinks that she has a certain knowledge about what the original text said and where they are and what belongs in and what's out. But I like playing with this idea that it doesn't actually matter because God gave us the power in the Church to bind and to loose, and we've bound. So now it's bound, and we're going with it. We've built this tradition, and it is a sacred tradition because that's what God allowed the Church to do. What do you think of that idea?
I think it's an interesting way of reconciling the differences, because obviously for Bart Ehrman, the reason that he left, or one of the things that first shook his faith, I think the reason he left was the Odyssey, but the thing that first shook his faith was the idea that, well, if God wrote these words originally, then why did he not preserve them? Why is it that we don't know what the original words written in the Bible were?
Who is this?
Bart Ehrman is one of the best-known textual critics of the Bible, of the New Testament specifically. He's a professor in New Testament studies. He literally wrote the textbook on it.
Which denomination is he?
Well, he's now an atheist, but he was a Baptist. So he originally went to Moody Bible Institute to learn about the New Testament, study it in the original language to find out what it meant. And he's now one of the world's foremost experts on the New Testament and the history of Christian forgery and interpolation and the polemics that Christians wrote about each other. So his books are really interesting. He writes, so he writes scholarly work, but he also writes for the general public. So that's one of the things that's great about his work, is that he's writing for the common man. Whereas it can be quite difficult otherwise to keep track of where people are going, because scholars will tend to descend into using really archaic language that it's difficult to track. But he does write popular books.
Yeah, it's all very complicated. I like to stick to principles that I can pin down and grasp and commit to. And going back to our original subject of the young Earth creationism, you know, I know that everything's stacked against me, and I know that I'm not really going to look into the evidence because it doesn't interest me that much. But I do feel the weight of the arguments all around me, and I'm just sort of enjoying the freedom that the church gives me to believe this. I'm not sure why the church gives me the freedom to believe this. Is it because it doesn't matter? It's not essential to my salvation? Or is it because there might be something to it? I don't know, but I'm just enjoying it.
I think it's more just the whole Reformation and the change of law in general, isn't it? Because a long time ago, heresy would have gotten you killed.
Yeah. Well, I can guarantee if there was a death penalty associated with young Earth creationism, then I would probably get in line with.
Well, I mean, before not adhering to young Earth creationism would have got you killed.
What do you mean?
As in, it used to be the standard party line of the church.
Oh, that's another reason why I'm attracted to it, is because it is a long-standing tradition, no?
Yeah, if you go back to the fundamentals, they were young Earth creationists. It would appear in the biblical days. So, for example, Jesus seemed to have believed, or at least the Jesus speaking in the Gospels believed that Moses existed and that Adam existed, which is a serious problem for people who believe in theistic evolution, because, of course, in evolution, Adam never existed. And if you follow archaeology, then Moses never existed. So there's a lot of problems. Abraham as well was another one that was disproved in the 1970s, I think. And the consensus has now moved towards them not existing. So there's obviously pockets of resistance which generally are religiously motivated.
What? Not that you're an expert, but what are the numbers like? I mean, in the Christian world, what do you think? Like, including all the Protestant denominations, is it maybe 50% that are young Earth creationists, or 10%, or?
I think once you factor in most of the world, then most young Earth creationists are actually Muslims. But within Christianity, most Christians, I would say, don't understand evolution. But I think most are accepting of evolution, and it's the smaller pockets in the Africas and in the like the southern United States, for example. They tend to be people who are young Earth creationists. It's also where the flat Earth movement took off. But in Europe, you'll find that most Christians will accept evolution. Although I suspect that the majority of people don't really understand it, because every time I meet someone who goes against evolution and doesn't understand evolution, it's precisely because they don't know what evolution is. They'll raise these objections to it, which turn out to be nothing to do with evolution.
Yeah. I think that education is the key. And I think if we're educating people into evolution, then good, faithful Catholics are having their faith weakened. And you would agree with me, because you'd say, yeah, because Catholicism is false and evolution is true. But I would say, because Catholicism is true, but evolution is a really good way of weakening the Catholic faith, and it's a danger, because the reality is that God's all powerful and He can do whatever He wants. And even if there's a lot of evidence against young Earth creationism, it's, whether you believe in Catholicism or not, you will agree with me that it's a more robust position in terms of clinging to the Catholic faith, and like you just said, the Bible and Jesus. It's a more robust position, digging your heels in and saying, well, I don't care about the mountains of evidence. God will explain it to me in heaven. And I'm just going to stick with what Jesus said. Jesus believed in Noah, and I believe in Noah. So do you agree with me? I know we're on different sides of the fence here, but do you agree with me that it is a better position if you want to maintain your faith, or no?
It's certainly a faith-based position.
Yeah, I mean, obviously,
That's the nature of faith, is to go against evidence, I think.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm not gonna say that the nature of faith is to go against the evidence, but there is something to the mystery of faith where it appears to be going against the consensus, or at least what the conventional wisdom of the age, or whatever it is, you know. But I feel like my faith is strengthened. I'm exhilarated by my renewed faith in the young earth creationism, and I'm cautious because I do see the mountains of evidence that are against me. But it's sort of like when you're in a relationship. Let's say you and your wife aren't getting along, but then you move to a new town and everyone's against you. Then your little differences disappear, and you just hunker down and you dig in your heels, and you really grow together, and you've got a common enemy and this sort of thing. So I think that this is sort of the position I find myself as a young earth creationist. Like, everyone's against me, not in a way that's personal, but there are lots of people who are antagonistic to the idea of young earth creationism. And so that sort of gives me a nice romantic space where I can just be more alone with God, more isolated, and more faithful in that way. So I'm just trying to portray sort of the psychology of being an outsider, being marginalized, and how it's kind of romantic.
Yeah, well, you can actually see this in the demographics of America, for example, the tribalism. So as they raise objections to evolution, what you've actually got is there are more American Christians leaving religion and becoming atheist, agnostic, or however you want to call it, non-religious. But there are also more fundamentalist, extremist religious people. So what's happening is this polarization where people go one way or the other and don't stay in the middle. So you're losing this sort of tolerant middle ground, and you end up with people completely leaving religion and people fully embracing religion. Like, the kinds of people who are anti-vaccination and kill children with faith healing and that kind of thing. So you end up with this disturbing divide where you end up with no one in the middle to bridge the gap. So it's quite a concerning thing, really. This is the sort of tribalism that leads to warfare. As far as going with faith, though, that's pretty much what they said about heliocentrism. When we discovered that the Earth is not the center of the universe, then it was a very theologically sore point, and people would refuse to believe it for theological reasons.
Yeah. I mean, I've had people emailing me and saying, flat Earth is next, and then geocentrism, the whole thing. Well, I guess geocentrism is a moot point. Once you're flat earther, then the geocentrism is not even relevant, right?
Yeah, because then the sun is just a picture.
Yeah, I did look up at the sun yesterday, or was it today? It might have been today, because we haven't had a lot of sun this winter, but now it's sort of spring here. But I did look up at the sun, and I did ask myself, does it look like it's, just a luminary, just a light in the sky, or does it look like a big burning ball? And I mean, my whole life I've assumed that it's a big burning ball of hydrogen, or whatever it is.
You can definitely feel the heat from it on your face.
Yeah.
There's actually a probe heading towards the sun. Did you know there's going to be a TV show where flat earthers try to find the edge?
No way.
But they're going to Antarctica. I don't know why. If they're looking for the edge, why are they going to Antarctica? They could go in literally any direction.
I listened to something about the flat earthers because everyone's pushing me like, yeah, you're going to be flat earther now, yay! And then I heard this little lecture, and it was talking about no one's allowed to go to Antarctica, and it's like armed guards are guarding it.
That NASA has a fleet large enough, and don't forget, they don't think that Antarctica's down at the bottom of the globe. They think Antarctica is in all directions. So they think that there's a fleet the size of the Earth circling the whole Earth.
Wow,
it's brilliant. Although there are flat Earthers all around the globe.
Yeah.
No need to rub it in. All around.
What's really interesting is that a lot of flat earthers are Muslims as well. It's actually quite popular in Islamic circles.
I work with a Muslim, and I asked him how old is the Earth, and he hummed and hawed. He didn't know, but he's sort of a moderate, non-practicing Muslim.
Well, you do get these people in the middle who So they can't bring themselves to believe the extremist perspective, but they're sort of feel emboldened by the fact that the extremists exist. Do you know what I mean? In the sense that, well, maybe I'm not that religious, but it's nice to know that some people are.
Yeah.
Sort of validates it, which is a bit of an issue where if people who are in the middle and the moderate areas don't chastise people who are on the extremes, then they end up being complicit in sort of authorizing them. So, like you get religious extremists who will bomb people or whatever they do. And then all these people who are moderate religious should really just crack down on them. They should be the people reining them in and going, you're making the rest of us look bad. But what they do is by still belonging to religion, they're actually giving, what are they doing? They're sort of authorizing this movement where they're saying, well, we're the same faith, we're all together. So it makes these people feel like they're part of a huge group when they're actually quite a minority extremist sect.
Yeah. I don't know a lot of Catholics. I don't know a lot of faithful Catholics either, obviously. If I don't know a lot of Catholics, I certainly don't know a lot that are faithful and that actually practice their faith and that do the minimum requirement of what it requires to be a Catholic. But and so if I don't know a lot of faithful Catholics, I certainly don't know a lot of young earth creationists that are Catholic. And I don't generally hang out with Christians. Most of my friends are atheists. So it's not like I'm getting a nice, warm, fuzzy sense of community by joining in with the young earth creationists, right? So how do you explain that psychologically? That I would take.
So you know how conspiracy theorists work, where they are part of the minority and they only have a few friends who agree with them, and it makes them feel special. It's one of the psychological diagnostic traits in terms of conspiracy theories. The idea that it feels like everyone is against me, but I'm the one that's right. It can be quite a buzz to think you're one of the few special people who's discovered the truth, and it leaves you tunneling further in. So this is a known thing in psychology. I can't remember if there's any special name for it or anything, but conspiracy theory in general, if you look at the psychology of conspiracy theories, and how that works and draws people in, there's actually a documentary on Netflix about flat Earth. Okay. And one of the things they do is they keep cutting to psychologists explaining what's going on in the heads of these people. It's fascinating. It's actually well worth a look. Plus, you get to see what they believe and why they believe it.
Okay. Was there any moment in time where you questioned a conspiracy? It doesn't have to do with religion. It could be anything. It could be the JFK conspiracy. Anything at all. What is the moment where you were most tempted to just get like, whoops, maybe there's something? No, there couldn't be. But just that one moment.
Well, so when I was growing up religious, I used to think that the rest of the world was against us. It was kind of, we're the Christians, we're the special ones, and then the rest of the world is Satan trying to defeat us, which I would say is a pretty major conspiracy theory.
But outside of the realm of religion, has it ever happened to you as an atheist?
In terms of, there are some possibly genuine conspiracies, but they usually involve people embezzling large amounts of money. But nothing where I felt personally attacked in any way. No. I don't go for the whole lizard people conspiracy or anything like that.
The Illuminati. They're coming to get us.
Yeah, I usually just find them entertaining.
What about this is completely off topic, but what do you think about the Freemasons? Why do people like talking about them so much?
It's akin to a religion, isn't it? It's a cliquey system. Where it makes sense, where you would like to be part of a group that makes you feel special. It's a very similar theme, I think. I don't actually know that much about the details of Freemasonry, but I do know they're parodied quite a lot in pop culture.
Yeah, one of our admin was Freemasonry, Catholic, and then returned to Freemasonry.
Oh.
Yeah.
It's almost religious, isn't it? The level of secrecy and the rituals.
Yeah, I think one of the main things is you've got to believe in God. I don't know what religions or what sort of religion is acceptable, but the main thing is God and all the secrecy behind there. I don't know what the whole story is, but they're supposed to move in very special ways.
Well, so they were quite successful. I don't know if they have the same hold as they used to. I think it's probably quite difficult to find demographics on it because of their secrecy.
Yeah. I do have. I come from a Scottish family, so we do have quite a few that are reputed to have been Freemasons, but not. My father denied being one, but maybe that's telltale sign that it was
That's
one.
how you know.
Yeah.
Only
And
the
when
true
he-
Messiah would deny it.
And when he shakes my hand, he folds his middle finger, and it's weird. I'm kidding. So have we done the hour?
Oh, yeah. I mean, we can stop whenever you like, or we can carry on.
Do you have any other question? I mean, I enjoyed talking with you. Is there anything else that any other questions you have about my bizarre faith? And you do understand that I'm willing to walk away from young Earth creationism if it's not true or if the church says so.
I suppose, yeah. So how would you know if it's not true? So if you disregard evidence and you disregard anything people say,
well, I don't disregard evidence. I'm willing to understand the problem of induction and that people can spin wild tales with the same pile of evidence. We can make a story that will fit the data. But the way I would know is if it becomes a dogma of the church. And I don't think that's going to happen within my lifetime. So I'm pretty much free to believe.
But you actually, what I can sort of see, you actually believe that faith supersedes evidence?
Well, I mean, evidence is real. I mean, I'm not going to deny, like, I mean, if I go to the restaurant and there's a fly in my soup, I'm not just going to be like, oh, well, God is good, therefore this fly isn't real and swallow it. I'm going to acknowledge reality. That's reality. But the question is, how did it get there? You know, there are different explanations for how that fly got into my soup, but I'm not going to deny the fact that the fly's in my soup. Same thing with like the fossil record or with, you know, stories of ancient civilizations or whatever. But I'm not even committed to, I don't even know how old civilizations are. I'm not committed to, like I said, to the 6,000 or 10,000 year old thing. But yes, I do give precedence to infallible dogmas of the church. And the reason I do that is because there's a hierarchy of sciences. You know, the natural sciences are good, but they're limited. And then we have above that, we have the science of philosophy. And then above that, theology. And finally, above that is God. God Almighty is science itself. God is knowledge, right? So God is perfect in that way. So obviously, if the Catholic Church is what she claims to be, and if she has the infallible truths of God Almighty defined in these dogmas, and there are, you know, probably about 500 dogmas that are defined, then they will be my absolute rock solid core of belief until such time as I abandon Jesus Christ as a false Messiah. If I have good reason to abandon Jesus Christ as a false Messiah, then I'll end up being a generic monotheist again or go back to solipsism.
So I would actually put science and theology both under philosophy, with philosophy being a very generic, you know, broad, just a way of thinking about things. And then you have subsections in that. But do you know what it is about the scientific method that makes it so good at finding out what reality is?
Repeatability, objectivity, and independent studies, blah, blah, blah.
I think falsifiability is the real key. So
yeah,
you're susceptible to confirmation bias if you go looking for things to confirm you. Like, you know, when you're talking about spinning tails based on the evidence.
Yeah.
But the scientific method is to ignore all the evidence that supports you and go, okay, that goes in the pile over there. But is there any single piece of evidence that proves me wrong? And if you can't find anything like that, then you've got a pretty good chance of saying, okay, this is probably true then.
Yeah. This is one of the things that I'm very tentative about when people say evolution is a crock of, well, it's full of baloney, whatever. When I say it's all just nonsense, I have a hard time thinking about how many years have scientists been looking at evolution? How many years?
Over 150 years of people, both from the theological side and from the scientific side, trying to disprove evolution. And that's what makes it the strongest theory in all of science. In fact, it rivals gravity for just the sheer amount of evidence supporting it.
Yeah. So I find it hard to believe that everyone's in on it and they're just playing along. Now, and because there are people on both sides, like you said, atheist and theist, that are playing along with the story of evolution. But yeah, I find that really hard to believe that people have that much ill will or that they're that easily deceived by Satan that they can independently get their science wrong in the same way. So yeah, it's like I said, it doesn't look too good for my position, but I'm not going to look too deeply into it because it's not essential for my salvation. But I'll keep an ear open, and now that people know that I'm a young Earth creationist, they're welcome to like send me emails and links and arguments. And you've presented good arguments. A lot of people have good arguments, and I'm open to them. And I just don't want to do the work. I don't want to like occupy myself with trying to find out the arguments. But people are free to send them to me. I'd appreciate it.
Oh,
Yeah.
I'd still have another stack of them.
Yeah, I'm not so sure that you are a young Earth creationist, because for a start, you don't believe it's the Earth is 6,000 years old. You're not sure whether evolution is or isn't.
Yeah.
So I'm not so sure that you perhaps wish to be under that category, but
Yeah.
I don't think you are actually.
Maybe, yeah.
Well, so what do you think of the usual method of explaining the evidence by people who have actually attempted apologetics for young Earth creationism, where they say that God created the world to look old, but it's actually young?
I don't like that.
I don't like that either. I think that makes God deceptive.
Yeah,
they don't like me
God
pointing
buried
that
all
out.
those apostles.
Yeah, so for anyone to oppose evolution but also acknowledge all this evidence for evolution, they would have to say that their God is a deceiver, basically, to go with that.
Yeah, I'll have to find out what people believe. I'm reaching out now. I reached out to one Catholic young Earth creationist, and he agreed to come on. I don't know if you know him. His name is Hugh Owen.
I haven't heard of him, no.
Okay. It's a very, very small website that he runs called the Colby Center for Creation, something to do with Catholic creation. But I'll be interviewing him, and I'll sort of assess his approach. But yeah, it's all very interesting. And
you have a talk with Aaron coming up as well?
Yeah. Possibly, tentatively. He agreed. He's very busy, but he did agree to come back. He's a bit annoyed with me because I said I'm a young Earth creationist now. But
yeah, I feel like he may go on a rant.
Yeah, that's going to happen.
Yeah, I'm hoping so, because my atheist audience loves that. So I
love watching Aaron rant. It's amazing.
Yeah, he's a nice guy, but I mean, I can't believe he gives me the time of day. Like, I mean, I email him and he always responds, and he keeps it brief, but he always responds to me. And he tentatively agreed to come back in early May, so I'm really looking forward to that. And like I said, most of my listeners on YouTube are atheists, and there's nothing they enjoy more than my Catholic versus atheist talks, because they just chalk it up as a win every time. Like, you lost again. I'm not trying to win. That's the thing. I'm just trying to talk to people, and I don't mind
dialogue.
Dialogue.
I did notice actually something I wanted to address, which is some of the really rude comments underneath that. And I think they're just giving us a bad name, and I want to apologize on behalf of the atheists who are horrified by the people who just give you grief and insult you all the time.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah, I noticed you're very nice to me and in the comments. And did you notice that one guy, Robert White? He's very venomous.
There was one guy who mentioned something about your wife, which was completely inappropriate.
That was Robert White. Yeah. He really doesn't like me. He doesn't like me. I'm
not entirely sure what they want to achieve, because all you're going to do insulting people is drive them further away. It's a terrible way to argue.
Yeah, there's something troubling him. There's something troubling him, and he may have been abused by a priest, for all I know. You don't know what people go through.
I do think there is a phase in deconversion when people leave any kind of cult, where they get upset at being deceived for so long, and that I went through the angry phase myself as well. It's probably quite rude to some people.
People. Yeah, go ahead.
But if you follow the logical extension of determinism, it's very difficult to be angry at people, because if you had, do you remember the "but for the grace of God, there go I" quote, where you're basically like, well, if I was born in their position with the exact same DNA as them and have the exact same upbringing, that's where I would be. I would be doing that right now. And to say otherwise is just arrogance, and it flies in the face of all the evidence. So yeah, I try to be sympathetic with people in any position where it could easily have been me.
Do you remember what St. Paul said? He said, "What do you have that you have not received? And if you've received it, why are you boasting like you didn't receive it?"
Yeah, absolutely. It gives you a sense of perspective when you consider that so much of where you are is just the luck of the draw. It's based on your family and friends around you, the experiences that you've had. What are we if not just a collection of memories? And based on the trajectory that led us here, very little of it was actually up to our own decision.
Have you ever met a man, or let's maybe use the case of a woman, but either way, a person of one sex who had one or more bad experiences with a person of the opposite sex, and then they sort of written off the opposite sex? Have you met people that are jaded in that way?
Yeah, a few people. There are people with bad experiences. Yes, it's definitely they have certain triggers as well.
But I mean, there's so many good people, good men, good women. I guess it's the few bad apples argument, right? Just because you've dated 3 really horrible men doesn't mean that there isn't a nice guy out there. There's a sort of blindness that goes with with those wounds, I guess, right?
This is the pattern recognition of human brains, where we tend towards heuristics, and you will go with your most recent, strongest experiences, and you'll project that onto the future. You'll say, obviously, if every door I try is locked, the odds are the next door I try is going to be locked. It's that kind of thinking. Which is great for survival, but it can lead you down the wrong path if you're not thinking completely logically about things. But you can definitely see it as a survival advantage, where if you assume the worst of people, and then they can pleasantly surprise you rather than being caught again.
I used to work when I was young. I used to work in sales, and I was doing door-to-door sales actually, and the basic idea was every no gets you closer to that yes. So you just go, it's a numbers game. You just go, no, 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 no. And you're smiling all the while because you know that you're coming up to a yes. And then you hit the yes, and then there's another string of no's. And it's a very optimistic sort of attitude that a salesman needs to have, certainly, right?
It must toughen you up to rejection, yeah.
Sound like a Jehovah's Witness. No, 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 yes.
Do they get yeses?
I don't know, but they knock on doors.
I bet they'd be shocked if you ever said yes. The worst job would be selling doors door to door, because as soon as you knock, you realise that you...
Yeah. I remember they used to, the window salesman used to go around breaking windows or paying kids to break windows, or maybe that's an old wives' tale. I don't know.
There was definitely a story about that with an air rifle and shattering windows, and then having a van parked conspicuously nearby, which had the name of a window repair company.
Do you know the story of firefighting? Do you know? That's a fascinating history.
Oh, what, the history of fire brigades being assembled? Because it used to be concerned citizens, didn't it, that would rush to a fire?
The story that I heard, I don't know if it's true or not, but I choose to believe it, let's put it that way, is that there was some guy that had the equipment in Rome or some ancient big city, and he would basically hold the house as ransom or as a hostage, and he would say, I can save your house, but you have to sell it to me cheap first. Like, I can just let it burn, but I have within my power to save the house, but in order for me to save it, you have to sell it to me right now at a ridiculously cheap price. Otherwise, I'll just let it burn.
Yeah, that would be like privatizing the fire industry. And the way that Rome's governmental systems worked was that effectively you'd end up with these rich people who could do what they liked with their own province. So yeah, I can definitely see that happening.
Nasty.
You'll have to find me. If you find the origin of that story, send it to me, because that sounds really interesting.
Yeah. So they probably didn't have calendars with the pictures of the firemen on them back in Rome.
Maybe some sort of wood carving.
Right. So I got to let you go now, but very nice talking with you both.
Yeah, it was a pleasure as always. I'm sure we can arrange another one.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us. It's been a good one. Second time around, and it's been enjoyable.
Very good. Thank you. Have you talked to many people since I was last on your show?
I think you were the next. I had some plans, but other things got in the way. So
I think we had.
You talked to
Deadlock was on, wasn't he?
Oh, that was before though. So I think.
Was it before?
Yeah, the most recent video was still you. So we've not had another guest in since.
Back to back.
Yeah, back to back.
Yes, it's not exactly been a roaring trade in this. Yeah, we're planning on doing some more.
Yeah, it's sometimes difficult to get people to actually join us, especially you can get a lot of atheists that join us, but the Christian Christian people don't seem to want to join us. I don't know whether they're frightened that we're going to rip them apart, or we're going to start calling names, but they just don't seem to want to join us.
I did say
Okay,
the
well-
more videos we do, the more likely people are to see our candor and
Yeah.
more likely to join. So
You can use me as a character reference. I'll be glad to make them feel comfortable coming on your show.
thanks. Okay, well, yeah, we'll let you go then. Enjoy the chat, and I'm sure we'll find something interesting to talk about next time as well.
For sure. Thanks a lot for having me.
Thanks very much.